Good.
Okay, you guys are in for a big treat today. You know, it's my birthday. I've saved this speaker for my birthday as a treat to me. Pat, no pressure, Pat. Pat is a wonderful treasure for our area in Gig Harbor. He lives in Fox Island, but he is the teacher. I met him as my teacher at Tacoma Community College, and I don't know, so many classes: early Christianity, Mediterranean culture, gods and magic. He's a fantastic lecturer, and we are lucky to have him in this area. Pat is a historian. He's a writer and instructor at TCC. He has an MA in ancient history, an MA in Mediterranean archaeology from the University of Leicester, and he is currently working on his PhD in ancient Mediterranean studies, having just completed his first monograph called Myth, Ritual, and Worship in Ancient Greece. I'm all there. I've got to read this. Pat's interests are people and societies of the ancient Mediterranean, and he's in so many societies of archaeology. I'm not going to list them, but you should know he and a group of people have started the Society for Antiquarian Studies. It's located in Fox Island, and they offer classes. So if you get the ancient bug, like I have gotten from Pat, you're going to want to know more about this. Now, his title today is stay with me here, Socio-Religious Analysis of Artifacts. If that doesn't get you, I don't know. What we modern people can learn from the complex society of antiquities. And if this is going to open a door, and you are going to love this. He's going to get you excited about, of all things, art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And so Pat, who used to be a policeman in South LA with gangs, is now, I'm presenting him to you guys. You are going to love this. Thank you.
Pat, you are muted. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Lana. I'll try to live up to the hype, but frankly, I'll do my best. I want to thank you all for having me here today. I have a PowerPoint to share in just a minute, and I'll get that up. But first thing I want to do is, I'm sure everybody here has gone to a museum and looked at the objects on display. And if it's a museum that's specializing in art, you've seen various of arts of different periods on display, and we all can look at the aesthetic nature of these objects and many times appreciate the beauty. But as a historian and archaeologist, my job is to kind of just stop looking at it as an object of art and looking at it as an object that represents the society and culture which produced it. And what can we learn about the people who produce these objects by taking a real deep analysis of the objects themselves? So to give you a little taste of what I do as an archaeologist, I get this stuff out of the ground and start looking at it there, and then it gets cleaned up and hopefully someday ends up in a museum. But to be honest, just to give you guys an idea, less than 1% of what's actually excavated in an archaeological dig ends up in a museum, either in what is known as an archival area, which never goes on display, or on display itself. So the amount of material that we get to look at in the field is rather limited. So it's more, as an archaeologist, I look at everything from coins coming out of the ground to pieces of pottery to actual architectural structures that we reveal, through excavation. But as someone who's interested in history, you can learn quite a bit about ancient peoples when you go to a museum by just looking at the objects, doing a little research on your own. The great thing now is most museums have Wi-Fi, and you can actually punch in the music. Like if you go to the Met, you can actually scan your phone over a bar reader, and then you get like a 3-page history on the object, which gives you more than just where it was found and what its period it's dated to, but what's the socio-religious aspect. Basically, in the ancient world, there was no separation of church and state, and many objects had dual meanings. They were representations of culture, but that culture was heavily infused with both religious and cultural beliefs and norms that were represented in that society. So without further ado, we're going to take 3 objects of art from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Particularly, these are from the classical Greek period, and we're going to look at them and discuss them, and hopefully, as Lana said, get you guys interested in history and archaeology. So I'm gonna share now. Oops. Okay. And you should all see now the screen as I've presented it. So I have to give full credit to the Met. When I was doing my research on my first master's degree, I made several contacts there because I had to use objects from their collection. And in order to publish my master's dissertation, I had to get permission, but I made friends. So I have some access to some of the archival areas of the Met. And so for that reason, I feel very comfortable using their collection with their permissions. Now, if you need to get a hold of me after this lecture, this PowerPoint's available. I'm going to send it to Lana. If any of you want it, you're more than welcome to have it and use it for whatever reason you want, or just to look up the objects that are going to be
Hey,
listed here. in the
Pat, I just
presentation.
wanted you to know I am recording it, so we'll put
Okay.
it out on YouTube.
Perfect. So if you need to get a hold of me, you can get a hold of me at my email at TCC. It's elowinger@tacomacc.edu. But I'm here today on behalf of the Society for Antiquarian Studies, which is a nonprofit educational foundation, which is really about giving access to both educators and students, particularly students from socioeconomically challenged backgrounds who want to engage in the study of ancient history and archaeology and the study of ancient cultures. And if you want to find out more about the Society for Antiquarian Studies, you can do so at our website, societyforantiquarianstudies.org. We do offer free online lecture series events. We have another one coming up soon, kind of a risque title, but it's prostitutes, courtesans, and concubines of the ancient world. It talks about the ancient sex trade, particularly in the Greek and Roman worlds, and what were the roles of predominantly a profession dominated by women, although men were present within it, and what were the social norms and taboos within that system. So if you're interested in that, that's going to be starting here, not this coming week, but next week. You can check that on our website. I believe it starts at Wednesday at 6 p.m. And it's free and to the public, and you can invite friends. So let's go ahead and jump in. And if you want to become part of the Society for Antiquarian Studies, I'll be more than happy to talk to you about it after the presentation or via email. And Lana can probably get you in touch with me also if you forget. So let's look at the first piece. Now, this piece is an object on display at the Met. My particular focus is ancient religion and the transmission of religious ideas. We call it synchronicity, when two religions butt up against each other and you end up having something new emerge out of that interaction. That's really the area of focus that I look at as a historian and archaeologist in my research. This piece is widely known to those that study ancient religions. Particularly, this is what we'd call Greek paganism. But it's also a beautiful piece of art. And if you were to see this piece on the display at the Met, you may just look at it, glance at it, and say, well, it's kind of dark, it's kind of, limited in its chromatography. It's black with some white on a, ochre colored field. It's not exactly the most impressive piece of art compared to other objects on display at the Met. But this piece dated to anywhere between 510 and be honest, when we say between 520 and 510, you got to give a little wiggle room there, but that's generally where archaeologists and historians believe this piece is dated to. This depicts a funeral in ancient Greece and tells us quite a bit about what ancient people believed and how they both celebrated and mourned the passing of friends, relatives, and dignitaries, particularly prominent people within cities and towns in which they lived. Now, this piece is known as Attic, which means it comes from the area around Athens. So it's nominally Athenian origin, or some of the towns and suburbs that we'd call suburbs today around the area controlled by Athens. Now, what does this depict? What does this tell us about funerals? Well, in ancient Greece, we know that there was a very complicated process of presentation of the body, an act known as prothesis, where the deceased would be prepared by women, their body to be ritually, wrapped, their bodies would be cleaned, particularly if they had died in warfare or in some tragic event, but their bodies would be oiled and fragrances placed upon it. Again, you're familiar with frankincense and myrrh. These were commonly used in the ancient world. And the body was laid in state where a ritual mourning would occur. And in that period of mourning, male family members and female family members would appear and actually go through a physical lamentation where they would wail, cry, and openly display the remorse for the person being deceased. Now, one important thing here is there is a unique commentary depicted in art that we know from literary sources, but this is also represented in art, that men were prohibited in ancient Greece from touching a dead body. Only women, particularly female family members, could engage with a deceased body, particularly because it was considered taboo. And Greek religion, ancient Greek religion, believed that the touching of a deceased person caused the person that did the touching to be polluted or no longer able to enter sacred areas for other ritual purposes. So basically there was a period of taboo placed upon someone, which after they touched the body, they'd have to undergo ritual purification or to be pure enough again to go into a temple or a sanctuary area for other religious activities. Something else that's very important here to notice is that the women seem to be grabbing their foreheads during their mourning. It was very common in ancient Greece for women to literally tear their hair out by the roots as a sign of mourning. And to actually have a bleeding scalp was a sign of a pure mourner. There would be critiques of women in Greek society if they were observed not to have pulled their hair out of their head in mourning of a lost family member and or husband. You know, how true is your grief was based on the amount of infliction of pain and hair loss, it seems, that you could then display publicly to people around as you left your home in order to, you know, take the body of the deceased on a procession to burial and or cremation. In ancient Greece, they practiced both practices. So public displays were important. At times, you could also hire, if you were rich enough or wealthy enough, you hire professional mourners who'd come in and supplement this activity to show how greatly missed the person was going to be. Again, we know the roles women played in this process. You know, the care and taking of the body was a primarily feminine role in Greek society. Men were much more observant and non-participatory. So we also can look at this, and at the period in time, this is the very late 6th century. We can see the standard manner of dress that was common. And these depictions will change. How were people dressed at funerals from the 6th to the 3rd century is something we can observe in art. In this particular case, both the men and women are wearing clothing. The women are dressed in a style of clothing known as a piplos and himation. That's basically the dress and shawl. The shawl was a much more complicated thing than a modern shawl. It could be wrapped around the head and then circled around the body for additional warmth. But in this case, it was very conservative dress for the period. And basically you could walk out of the house, cover your head and face very easily, and also portions of your arms, which seems appropriate for, undergoing the ritual of mourning at the time. Now, just because they're quote unquote dressed in black, that doesn't necessarily mean their clothing was black. We actually have, we have to compare the art versus the actual archaeological evidence. And it shows that women wore a wide variety of colors when they were mourning, although darker colors seem to be slightly more prominent than lighter ones, but lighter clothing was wear during that time. Additionally, size matters. And if you notice, the men and women are roughly the same height depicted, which shows that they're adults, but also pictured in your lower right-hand corner as a small child. And children were expected to participate in the act of ritual mourning. Again, we know this from literary evidence, which is also present here in this depiction. But children were supposed to be seen and not heard in ancient Greece, particularly during adult activities, or predominantly adult activities such as, funerals or funerary activities. So a child is present, but if you notice, both in size, scale, and proximity, they're out of the way. It also shows us it gives a commentary on, societal roles towards children and not yet adults in ancient Greece during times like this. Furthermore, what do you do after a funeral? Well, if you're a prominent person or your family could afford it, you throw games in honor of the decedent. And you can see that just shown in the bottom. Now, where do we get this from? One of the earliest literary traditions we have about funerary games actually goes back to Homer's Iliad. If you remember, in book 23, Achilles, after the death of Patroclus, gives elaborate games in celebration of the passing of his cousin after his death in battle at the hands of Hector. And those games last several days in celebration. Now, in ancient Greece, this was still very common, and chariot racing was a elite but very normal activity, particularly for wealthy and well-known people to have funerary games in their honor. So a period of mourning is followed by a kind of a joyous celebration and recognition of this person's life, and I think it's a little bit of giving some solace to the population and to the family that their family member is going out, quote unquote, on a good feeling with both friends and neighbors and other celebrants. Now, with smaller, less well-known and wealthy families, these celebratory games could be just literally a family affair, very limited in scope, and could, I don't want to say be as simple as a racquetball game, but in the scale, poor people tended to do much more things associated with common activities. So, foot races were common, and things such as that didn't quite have the cost value, the cost associated with them, but still serve that societal value. As far as we gave our grandfather a great send-off, we had a foot race with all the neighbors of our small village, and that could itself be seen as a way to celebrate the lives and deeds of the deceased. So any questions about that piece before we go on? Oh, and if I didn't tell you, that little where it says Met Museum number, if you type that number into the Met search engine, that will get you right to this piece. That's the accession number. Anything? Okay. If not, we'll continue on. You can ask me questions at the end. This next piece, we know that the ancient Greeks had quite a unique understanding of the afterlife. Most people think that pagan cultures didn't believe in an afterlife, and that's actually very incorrect. Actually, pagans had a pretty developed theory of the afterlife. There were many planes of existence, if you want to consider them that, or realms, if you want to use that terminology, that existed in, quote unquote, the afterlife. After, where did the spirit proceed in death? Now, something to understand, in most pagan traditions, although it's not always the case, but most ancient Greeks, particularly the classical period, and that's before Alexander in 323 comes to power, and we call that the Hellenistic period, but really from the 6th through almost the end of the 4th century, Greeks had a perception of the afterlife that was basically one of spirit only, that your body ceased and your spirit continued. So Greeks did not believe in a physical afterlife. They believed in a spiritual afterlife, which not uncommon in, contemporaneous religions throughout the Mediterranean, although there were some others that believed in a bodily afterlife, particularly places like Egypt and others. But what's important is that Greeks knew that death was inescapable, and that this transition from a physical form to a spiritual form was something you couldn't go back on typically. Now, there is a small sect of ancient Greeks that believed in reincarnation, but we don't have time to get into that subspecialty. But generally, most Greeks believed that the sloughing off the mortal coil was the mortal form. It was beyond that was a spiritual existence. Now, what's so important about this piece? Well, this is alekthios, which is a specific type of jar or vase designed to hold oil. Why is oil important? Because olive oil in particular, was used for a wide variety of purposes, everything from cooking, but commonly it was used to light lamps. That was the number one use of olive oil in the ancient world. Less cooking like today, much more keeping the oil and the lamps in your house lit. This piece is dated to the mid 5th century, 440 BC, and it depicts a mourner. Now, if you'll notice, there's two tones. One person's drawn kind of lifelike, and that would be your person on, as you look at this, would be on your left. And then there's in between them is a funeral stele, which is just a grave marker. And on the right is a person drawn in a much more transparent form. That's the decedent, or the person that's passed. This is a artistic representation of the Greek belief that the living are distinctly separate from the dead, and that the transition point is death. And that's what that having that stele or that grave marker between the living and dead symbolizes. Now, you may ask me, and I think it would be a really good question. Yeah, but Pat, how do you know that the person's really dead and it's not just washed out from time or just bad art? Well, if you'll notice, there's a small squig, like a squiggle over the lighter person on the right's head. That represents psyche or spirit. And that was actually an art, a convention. So you would know, I put the squiggle there, and it was just throughout the throughout the Greek world, and other cultures pick it up too, to represent the spirit of a person. So that mark over a head is a representation of psyche or the spirit or soul. And that was a concept that each person had a physical form and a spiritual form, which often looked just like your physical form, but was transparent and, not corporal, but was a spiritual only form, but was a reflection of your true form in life. So a ghost per se, but that's the form that they took. It was transparent and, semi-luminescent, and it was how the Greeks believed you walked around in the afterlife. Now, the other interesting piece that this piece shows us is that when the spirit traveled to the underworld, that was a place down. We will actually, not in this piece, but sometimes we will see a spirit who is drawn into the ground at waist height, and the legs are missing. And you ask yourself, why are the legs missing? And that represents the fact the person comes out of the underworld in order to speak to the living, which we don't have time to talk about ancient witchcraft and magic, but summoning forth spirits was something the ancient Greeks and others in the Mediterranean believed you could do. But by doing so, you brought them forth from the underworld, which was a physical place that they had lived, and they came out of the ground. In this piece, the person being fully above ground, shown that they're there already, that they're not being summoned, they're just present on the other side of this barrier represented by the funeral marker. Now, why is this person going to this grave marker? Well, we can't really tell from this piece, but it was very common in the ancient world to, even after someone passed, leave offerings and gifts for the deceased. This was a way of honoring the dead. Ancestor veneration, sometimes termed ancestor worship, although that's somewhat of a misnomer, is what ancient Greeks, even the Romans practiced this, where you went to the tomb of a family member who was deceased and basically prayed to them that they would help watch over your family or on your behalf, make sure that other divinities, which we don't want to talk about gods and goddesses, but there's a whole hierarchy in the ancient world of gods, spirits, daemons, not demons, that's later, but daemons and other spirits. In the Roman world, they'd be known as lares, spirits that were protective in nature. And maybe this ancestor could speak to those spirits on your behalf and help them protect not only your family, but, even by extension, the state. The town you live in, but more it was focused on family than anything else. So if you didn't honor the dead, what happened to you in ancient Greece? Well, if they weren't properly honored, you didn't pay them the respect they were due, they would start haunting you. That was very common. Ghost story was real. Hauntings were a real thing in ancient Greece as far as they believed. And typically when someone said, hey, I'm being haunted, the natural inclination is why'd you dishonor the deceased members of your family? Now, that's not always the case, but that's what many people would say is the primary reason. Well, if you're being haunted, it's your own fault. But there were other reasons it could cause hauntings. But again, we don't have time to talk about ancient witchcraft and magic. But in order to appease this spirit, you would, again, start honoring your ancestors properly. Perhaps it has to do with the fact their tombstone marker or their grave marker had kind of fallen over, and you have to set it up right and undergo some ritual purification because you hadn't shown respect, give additional offerings and blessings, or possibly hire a magos or a priest or magician to come in and divine what was making the spirit unhappy, and then you have to fulfill that obligation. So again, these markers and this representation shows that the relationship between the living and the dead was highly complex, but the dead were in a form that could be contacted and communicated with by the living in various ways. And that's what this person's doing by going to the grave of someone deceased and either offering an offering or attempting to honor them and or contact them in the afterlife. So any questions about that piece before we continue, or you can save your questions to the end. All right. Last piece I want to look at. Now, again, it's artistically, it's very beautiful. This is known as white figure pottery. It's there's three major classifications of pottery in the ancient world: white figure, red figure, and black figure. You can learn all about the stylistic forms, how this pottery is produced. It's beautiful, but as a historian archaeologist, I care less about how pretty it is and more about what it says. What is this piece showing us about the ancient world? We see a properly to scale funeral stele, or a stele, basically tombstone of the ancient world. And again, the interaction between the living and the dead, the commentary is more important to me than necessarily how pretty it is and whether or not it's worth $30,000 or $100,000, as many pieces are. And the last piece I want to look at is not a piece of terracotta or clay. It's actually a gold ring. And this piece is probably the most poignant of all the pieces we're going to discuss today, because it has numerous meanings. Now, much like modern people today, the ancient Greeks exchanged rings upon betrothal. Basically, when you were engaged, a woman who was engaged was no longer eligible. Men didn't always have that same social convention. We don't have time to go into that, but as far as fidelity within a marriage, it was much more on the woman than on the man. And we can just talk about that later. But in the ancient Greece, a woman who said she was betrothed and didn't have a ring was usually doubted as being so. Now, even among the poorest of the poor, non-slaves, but citizens of ancient Greece, who, landowning farmers, basically poor people, women received a token of this type. Now, it may have been bronze, it may have been silver, it may not have been gold, but a woman was expected to be given a token that she could publicly display. Sometimes it was a necklace, but that was extremely rare. A token she could display as a betrothal, that she was a woman no longer eligible for marriage. Particularly, this is going to happen pretty young in Greek society, somewhere between the age of 13 and 15, sometimes earlier, sometimes later. At 17, you were considered a matron. So you were quite senior in the market, so to speak, at 17, 18 years old in ancient Greece. Now, this piece is embossed, engraved piece, with a interesting and very, taking time to look at it, tells us quite a bit. The woman sits on a stool, one leg of which is visible. You can't really see the other one as well. She wears her hair bound, probably with inside a sack known as a sakos, behind her head, but we can't really tell from this, but it's highly suggestive of that. But anyway, her hair has been methodically placed on top of her head in some type. Typically, women in their nuptials wore their hair in this manner, particularly in the 5th century. So we see other depictions like this, which gives us indications that this woman is probably preparing to be married or has just recently been married, because for a few days after your marriage, you still kind of, you went out in public as a newly married person. So in this case, it's suggesting that she's preparing for her nuptials. Her hair is bound. She wears earrings. You've noticed she's wearing dangling earrings right here on her ears, which again, women typically wore quite a bit of adornment during marriage. The marriage ritual was fairly elaborate. It started off at your home. You transitioned through town. There was a procession. Even among poor people, there was a formal entry into your new home, which would be your father-in-law's house if your husband didn't have his own home yet, and you'd be formally adopted into the home, into the family. There'd be a small ritual ceremony. Offerings were made in the home. So even though it may not be officiated by a priest, it was officiated by members of the family and was considered significant community-wide. Now, among middle class and upper crust people, this ritual involved a lot of the town, where people would line up and give cheers to the betrothed couple. They would go to the local temple and stop on the way, stop and make ritual offerings before heading to the new home, particularly the home of the husband to be, whether or not he had his own or lived with his extended family. That ritual will be performed there, in addition to rituals performed on the way and while ingressing to that location. Again, she wears a chiton, which is slightly different style of clothing, she's wearing hymnation. Again, that very ritual shawl. This is a smaller version of it that could be pulled over the head and then taken down. Covering your head during marriage ritual at certain points was the norm, and we see numerous depictions both in other art and in literature about it. She wears bracelets, so she's adorned with quite a bit of jewelry. But almost more important than showing her, which is important, so we get to see what a woman during this period would be wearing as part of the marriage ritual. We get to see some of the spiritual aspects. What did women want? What did women want to invoke? What were some of the gods or spirits that were to be invoked during marriage to ensure happiness? One of those is Eros. Now, Eros is related to Aphrodite, Aphrodite being a goddess of fertility and sexuality, a little bit more about the act, but Aphrodite is going to have multiple venues. But in terms of marriage, Aphrodite would be kind of the more lustful side. Eros is kind of longing and desire. So that feeling that you can't just, you think about someone and your heart pitters and pangs, well, that would be caused by Eros. So in this piece, the woman is, you would think Eros is trying to fly into her face, but that's not what this is actually depicting. What this is depicting is Eros is touching her shoulder, and he has, it's hard to see because the ring's somewhat worn, but here is a wreath, placing it on her head. Now that's symbolic in the ancient Greek world for the divinity giving someone a blessing per se. So again, Eros is blessing her, not with lust, but with hopefully a longing that her husband will show upon her. So in the ancient world, there was quite a bit of sympathetic magic shown in the ancient world. Basically, in this case, if I have the spirits make my husband long for me through this ring, and I show the depiction of that, then maybe it'll become true. So depictions like this were religious, but there was a little bit of magic. Magic and religion were very similar in many of their aspects. But in this way, this woman in this depiction on the ring is hoping that Eros will bring not necessarily romance, but a desire between the two of them to remain together and to love each other for a fruitful marriage. Now, why is that important for a woman in ancient Greece? Why is having a man long for you and not necessarily lust for you important? Well, in ancient Greece, women were in many ways second-class citizens. Actually, they weren't citizens at all. And upon marriage, effectively, women became property of their husband. A woman's status in her family, there was divorce, so it was a complicated legal process, but a woman who was non-fruitful would often lose her standing within a family, and a husband in ancient Greece could remarry. So having a husband who longed for you, that usually ensured some type of sexual union, which the hope of having offspring, having children. Children were an important facet of ancient Greek life for a woman's social standing, whether she was poor, middle class, or upper class. The inability to produce women was often seen as the gods cursing you. So again, being fertile and being able to reproduce for a woman was very important. The second thing is there was the issue of illegitimacy. Husbands who didn't have the social strictures that many would consider today within marriage. Men could have liaisons with women that weren't their wives and or slaves. And those children, if the wife was unable to produce legitimate heirs, would have to contend against illegitimate heirs. It was very common in ancient Greece for a slave son to be adopted if there wasn't a male legitimate heir in succession. The Greeks were a patriarchal society, and as such, having male offspring was extremely important during the classical period, particularly because remember, in order to be a citizen, you had to be able to serve in the military. So you had, military service was compulsory for all citizens of ancient Athens, where this particular piece is believed to be from. So this piece is reminiscent of hope, desire, depiction of the act of preparing for marriage, but also shows the hopes and desires of the soon-to-be bride, not in the short term, that would be Aphrodite, but the long term, with the depiction of Eros, a god or spirit that's going to help her husband remain interested long after nuptials are concluded and into years beyond that. So this piece doesn't have it, and the piece I was going to use has not as good of front, but on the back, typically small little sayings like "Let him love me," or "May the gods bless me," or "May Eros bring him to me," or sometimes just the husband's name, and then beloved by. These small little short, if you want to call them prayers or affirmations, or typically they're incantations because they invoke a name of the recipient and a god. So that's in ancient ritual, that would be an invocation. So this ring not only was a symbol of a woman's marital status, it was both religious in tone and may have served as a magical charm or religious charm or token for veneration of the deities that they worship. So with that, we've just examined 3 pieces from the Met's collection. They're all beautiful, on display at the Met currently. But I'm willing to take any questions now if you want to throw them at me.
I have a question.
Sure.
You mentioned the value of that earlier vase that we saw, but what about that ring? What would its value be?
Well, as just in gold, it's it's a typical gold ring. We can price it that way, but as the artifact it is, these pieces are usually worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it's more based on the rarity of the piece, the quality of the piece, than anything else. I find it hard. So sometimes, like, you can go to different clearinghouses and you can actually buy some pieces. You can buy a piece that would end up going to private. That's why there's so many private collections throughout the world, particularly coins and rings and things like this. Pottery is often Barclays, for example, sells stuff like this. So you have to be, pieces range from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars, depending on what they are, what the material are, what grade are they. As far as this is where art historians and archaeologists tend to fight with each other. Art historians tend to grade these things in terms of value in current market dollars. Archaeologists look at them. I look at cultural significance, and sometimes something's worth $10,000 is, like, to me, more important than something worth $3 million, because it's a piece of the Elgin marbles, right, that are currently on display at the British Museum. Now, marble's more expensive than terracotta or pottery. Doesn't necessarily mean it has more cultural significance, right? So I tend to try to stay away from the debate that art historians get into about how much is something worth, particularly when it's a piece of ancient culture and a reflection thereon.
Yes, I have a question.
Sure.
Are there still items that you believe that are in the ground that could be excavated, that could be found, that could be a part of that ancient history, or are those items pretty much exhausted?
No, every summer we find stuff that ends up going to museum collections. We didn't dig last year in 2020, but in 2019 we were digging in an area. The harbor since of the city that we are digging in has since receded, and silted over. Siltation took over, and we dug an area that was probably in use during the 3rd century CE AD, and we found what we call them a votive dump, but basically what we found were numerous small bronze statuettes of Osiris and Isis and some other deities like Zeus that appeared to have been dumped in the harbor. Now, whether they were dumped purposely or accidentally, it's all conjecture, but it's happening right about the time of Diocletian, maybe going into the 4th century. So we're trying to date them properly. If they were dumped in the 4th century, it would mean time to dump the pagan stuff because the Christians are coming. Or if it was dumped before, it might have shown offerings being made to Osiris and Isis themselves, who were deities associated with the river, right? So you're in Romania. Why are these Egyptian gods and goddesses being worshipped in the Danube Delta? Well, I can tell you, because in the 3rd century, a very misfortunate group of Egyptian soldiers recruited in the Roman Empire were sent from the Delta in the Nile to the Delta in the Danube, from beautiful African coast to frigid winters, and the Danube Delta, only because they were experts in piloting shallow bottom craft.
Hey, Pat, I think we have to come to an end.
Oh,
We're
okay.
running
Sorry,
out of
Gunda.
time. last question over. Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. Very
All right.
interesting. Thank you very, very much.